Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Mike. And I'm really grateful to be honored to be asked to come to this conference and to be the first keynote speaker. I'm quite thrilled for a number of reasons. I guess the first reason is how much I can learn from Australians. This morning's panel is quite mind-boggling to me to see how far and how serious and committed Australians. I don't think there's any country in the world that is trying to exploit to use their educational resources and to export them as well. So I congratulate you, and I know I've got lots to learn. Another reason I'm really pleased is to see some old friends and hopefully to meet some new friends here. It's always great to expand one's network. And a third reason is that my wife came along, and I'm celebrating her putting up with me for 30 years this month. And so it's nice for her to come along. But the real reason why I'm thrilled to be here is this is my house last week. Oh. Well, you can hardly see. It's much nicer on my screen. You can see that we had about 3 feet of snow, and it got to be 35 below the week before I left, and so it was really nice to come. It's really nice to get a chance to be here. What I'm going to talk about is this whole, our schizophrenic relationship between pedagogy and technology that seems to always come up when distance educators talk. We're dependent upon technology, but we don't want to be technologically driven. And so partly to sort of get around, I think it was Bruce said this morning that academics always like to pigeonhole things and make typologies and classification systems. And we've done this with the generations of education technology, and I've tried to have a sort of a heuristic and a way to think about 3 generations of distance education technology. And we see all 3 of them here talked about and proponents of it. And one of the challenges is just when you get quality people who are in one of these generations and they argue with the people in the other generation, they never come to even what do we mean by quality under these. So, and I apologize, I did parts of this in New Zealand a few months ago, and so for those who are hearing it for the second time, my apologies. But I have tried to develop my own thinking about which kind of knowledge is most appropriate for each one of these generations. And the generations, like the generations of technology, we have additional developments, but the first and the second generations have not gone away. They're still vibrant, and we'll talk about ways that technology is enhancing the teaching and learning of each of those generations. So, but I always talk about values because I think it's really important that we realize why we're trying to get into education in the first place, and especially expanding access through distance education. And I think that it's very easy for us early adopters anyways to get very complacent and to think that the way we're doing it now must be the best way, and it must be the most effective and most efficient. I think we always have to challenge ourselves that we can do better. We can increase the appeal, the cost, and time efficiency of the learning experience. And second, I think we're seeing a growing international trend where students are demanding more, they're more responsible, they want freedom, they want choice, they want to be able to take learning in ways and in means that meets their unique needs. And finally, just the idea that, and we saw that with Mark's slides this morning about the demand for international education. It is not going to be met by traditional means. We just can't afford it. And thus we have to figure out ways to give that basic human right to each of us. I wanted to start with a short video, and it's about a face-to-face student who's in grade 7. This was done by a colleague, Wendy Dexler from the University of Florida, who's a good friend who I've never met yet, but I think that as you watch this, you'll challenge yourself to think, I don't want to give the net generation thing that these students are totally different and they're not anywhere near the same. Not that at all. But notice how she uses the tool, she controls her own learning, and she merges her lifelong experience and her fun and games with her formal education. So it takes about 3 minutes, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
Welcome to my personal learning environment. I've been practicing network learning in my 7th grade science class. I spent some time at the beginning of the year learning how to find information online and how to pull it all together on a personal page. As you can see, there's lots of stuff here. Some things, like my Facebook account and the blocks across the top, are not for school. I organized all my schoolwork along the bottom row. Every morning, when I come to class, I visit the science agenda to see what we're doing for the day. Sometimes there are videos to watch or other work to do. Other times, I decide what I need to work on next. One day, we played a game called Pocket Tanks, and I used it to learn how to write an official scientific report. That was created on my Google Docs account and published for anyone to see. We have a lot of animals in our science class. I can create a special report to get certified to hold them, but I have to do research first. I find websites and post them to my social bookmarking account. These are some of the sites I found about the leopard gecko. I posted my certification report on my blog. Now I can hold Sarah during class. I also use my blog for reflections about what I did in class for the day. There's so much information on the internet. I use a special note-taking program to help collect information I find on websites. I can clip small bits of text or pictures from different websites and keep them for later. The best part is it keeps track of where I found the information so I can give credit and find what I'm looking for. We recently finished a special project about poisonous and venomous creatures. I made a presentation to help other people tell the difference. After learning about a lot of different poisonous and venomous creatures, I decided to do some research on the box jellyfish because I'd seen shows on Discovery Channel and thought it was interesting. I created a digital poster called a Glogster. It lets me put text, video, audio recordings, and cool graphics all on one page. My teacher says it's important for scientific work to be peer-reviewed, so I emailed a scientist in Australia. I asked her to look at my Glogster and let me know if the information is correct. I haven't heard back from her, so I emailed another scientist in the United States. Some of my classmates have already heard back from their experts. Sometimes we use Skype to video conference and ask the scientists questions. I really like learning this way because we get more freedom. It's not like I can choose not to do something. It's just...
Oh. Interruptions from automatic machines. Well, it was just about over. I think you get the point. It's the kind of student we need to run our PD sessions at Athabasca anyways. But I guess what I was thinking when I watched this is a student like this going to be satisfied with our current generation of distance education delivery? And I'll just speak for Athabasca. I think they will be quite frustrated, actually. So I think that's the challenge. Whether it's better kinds or not better kinds, a student like this can add, contribute, can help build these learning package. Oh. Well, okay, so I'm sure you've had this discourse about the generations of technology in distance education, the print correspondence, the first generation, second, the mass media, third being the interactive technologies, and Jim Taylor has talked about fourth and fifth generations. Lots of people got articles talking about generations, thought it was a good idea for me to go on to the pedagogical side of it. But I've also found that a lot of distance educators especially are really convinced that they can't be technologically driven, and they're sort of really anti-technology to some degree because they think, oh my God, you know, I've got to be driven by student needs and by pedagogy. But they don't realize that without technology of some kind or another, we wouldn't be in the distance education business. So I like to think of them like a dance, is that the technology sets the beat and the timing, the affordances of that technology, but it really should be the pedagogy that defines what you do with it. So what we heard this morning was all kinds of paradigm wars. You heard Yanni talk about, you know, it's not like it was before, and other people who say, you know, well, thank God it's not like it was before, and we're sort of this constant struggle between the different paradigms. And but the one thing to remember about technology is that, especially the modern net technologies, is they're flexible. They're defined by the users as much as they're defined by the creators. So you can take a technology and you can mold it and adapt it in ways that were never even thought about by the original designers. So you have interpretive flexibility. Different social groups use the technology differently. There's flexibility in design. And the conflicts are often great learning experiences when people dealing with that same technology in different ways. So I've defined 3 generations of distance education pedagogy, and I'll go through them briefly and then talk about how the technology is enhancing each one of those 3. The first being the behaviorist cognitive, which led for our self-paced individual study model. The second, the constructivist models, based on, which with a group base, and the new and emerging connectivist models based on networks and collectives. So I grew up in Calgary, which is where cowboys live in Canada. And one of the nice things about the behavioral cognitive pedagogy is very simple. You know, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, and tell them what you told them. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you're going to tell them. Just like cowboy poetry, you know, just move straight forward, no deviations. But with academics, we couldn't get away with cowboy talk. So Gagne and others talked about the events of instruction and gaining the learner's attention. All of this is true, and it makes sense, and it is a very valid way to bring students along to learning content. But then the cognitive revolution came along, and we started learning about chunking how much of this content, how to distribute it, how much cognitive load, how much we can have in working memory, multiple representations, and the need to have variations, and multimedia effect. This 1990s educational media research was heavy into the cognitive revolution. And, but if you're like, what's the kind of knowledge that's best transmitted by this kind of pedagogy? And it's a kind that's logically coherent, generally exists independent of the perspective of the learner or even of the teacher, largely context-free. It is capable of being transmitted, but it assumes a closed relationship with discoverable relationships between what's put in and what comes out the other end. And behavioral cognitives love learning objectives. If you went to teacher school at the same time I did, everything you did, you had to have a learning objective in behavioral terms or you're out kind of thing. So. But there's lots of new developments coming along, specifically in reflection amplifiers, where we're trying to say to students, okay, this is the content, this is what we expect you to learn, and this is the sequence, but think about how you're learning it and what is happening in your own head. So we're trying to get them to go beyond the behavior to that cognitive processes and getting them to be more self-aware. And we do that often by now allowing them to compare themselves. There's been some very interesting talks and work coming on analytics, but we're mostly us as institutions or faculty studying what learners do. But as we learn, we will, or as our tools improve, we will allow them to watch themselves progress through, and hopefully that they will start to use the cues that they're generating from their activities. And the digital footprints that they leave, the archive, they can see, well, how did other students get through this content, and how long did they spend, and what assignments did they do? And maybe those assignments can stay there instead of disappearing all the time because of the persistence of the net. We're learning lots more about multiple representations. When does audio really help, and when do you need video, all that sort of thing. And finally, I'll talk more about analytics, student modeling and adaptation. Student modeling, the idea, is that the student, whatever they did before, will influence where they're going, so that the content will change in demand to the individual student. That's been the holy grail of computer science sort of driven behavioral cognitive thinking, is that the package shouldn't just be a package. It should diverge depending on the student model. So adaptivity, this is one of the major research projects our computer science department at Athabasca has, and they're trying to extensively model the learner's actions, their interactions, their mood, their tends of preferences, their skill, their implicit and explicit changes. And by doing that in real time, they will then be able to alter the content that's presented to them. And there's also some developments, because it's kind of a big brother kind of a system. But again, one of the goals is to give the student back control so that they can see their student model that's being created. And they can adjust it, and they can say, that really isn't the way I am, or that was just a fluke, or I was sick yesterday. But sort of to get away from the big brother sense of a lot of this user modeling. And that's getting right into learning analytics, and Athabasca is sponsoring the first international conference in Banff next in about 2 or 3 weeks. Still time to register, bring your skis. And What learning analytics does, at least the web-based proponent that's now, is that they're trying to not just model the students' activities or actions through your content, but look at all of the activities that they're engaged in on the net and sort of be picking off, building profiles from sort of a whole diverse set of patterns. And again, this is work that the Bill Gates Foundation and Google has supported recently, and it's a very hot topic, and it's still a bit the Holy Grail kind of scene, but you can see the potential. And of course, open educational resources. First generation is really content. I mean, that quality content done by professionals is a big part of what defines a quality first generation pedagogy. And there is a whole forum on open educational resources, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But I want to just have a little advertisement. I've got 5 new books that I want to give away to. Does anybody have a birthday today? Nobody. Oh, she's not here? But you'll take it? Okay, well, how many, put your hand up if you have a birthday this week. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3. Okay. Well, if you have a birthday this month. Okay, well, we're about at 10, so all of you get 5 free books plus 10 years worth of International Review of Research in Open Distance Educated Learning, the journal that I edit. But how many people have had or will have a birthday this year? Okay, the rest of you, you can all go to these sites and you can get those 5 books and you can get the first 10 years of Ivrodel. And those who didn't put your hand, we can mail a copy to your estate for $10. I think some of these articles, the books are quite good, especially instructional designers will like The Designer's Edge. Muhammad Ali, who's speaking on the last day here, a mobile learning book. If you're teaching science at a distance, the first one. And George Villasano says Emerging Technologies, and the one I did a couple of years on Theory and Practice. And if we are looking for new authors with Athabasca University Press, an open press, but I did get a check for $600 royalty from people who actually bought paper copies of that. So don't feel that you have to settle for these crummy electronic versions. You can go online and one will be, or you can get it from Amazon as well. Okay, but all the focus on content is a bit challenging when people start giving their content away. You know, the holy, your crown jewels, and people are saying, oh, I want to have them for free, and you think, oh my God. So it's a paradigm shift to think, well, how do we deal with content? And I've also been a little dismayed to see at some distance education schools how faculty define themselves by the content that they create. And so if they give it away or if they take somebody else's content, then what's their job anymore? So we have to reconceptualize what our job as designers and developers and teachers is to be taking resources, making them into courses and programs, but also contributing back as well and, you know, doing our fair share. If you've been in instructional design school, you know all about Dick and Carey's instructional design model that defined the correct way to produce courses. And I'm not going to go through all of these phases at all, but what comes out is that there's the division of labor and teamwork and specialized expertise. All of those things are greatly enhanced by net resources. And if you look, it allows effective project management. One of the big challenges is, you know, you have this team, they are increasingly distributed or across different institutions. Unless you have a good package, some kind of a way to control things, it just bogs down and you can't move things, you don't know whose deadline is responsible, all that sort of stuff. There's the synchronous and asynchronous communications is practically free. Archiving and version control was a big problem, is much less so now with cloud computing. Interoperability, reuse, and distribution are becoming more important because we have opportunities to reuse, to put them in repositories. And there's tools like, this is a product from Canada, Thinking Cap, which is just specifically designed to manage the content production. So there are many ways that technologies enhance production and learning of the first generation cognitive behaviorist pedagogy. Moving on now to the second generation constructivist pedagogies. I'm sure that most of you have read lots of articles about constructivism and constructivist thinking and instructional design models and how it influences distance education and face-to-face learning. But the importance of the context of the learner and how having errors and contradictions is not a bad thing. It's actually useful, and that learning is an active process and social meaning. But the second last point, the importance of multiple perspectives. In constructivist learning, it always works best at a group, and so that you get to hear and feel what the context of that person's thinking means as their assumption of or learning progresses. And of course, with the first generation, there was no group interaction because it wasn't possible. But in constructivist learning models, that it could be asynchronous or it could be synchronous, but there is always some sort of a group model. And learning is located in context and relationships rather than in the minds of individuals. It's group learning, and we do know from research that groups provide motivation, they provide feedback, they provide alternative and conflicting viewpoints. And this is mostly work that's done in blended or in face-to-face environments, but even at Athabasca, we find our completion rate goes straight way up when we start pacing people and running them through distance education in groups. Students who learn in small groups generally demonstrate greater achievement, express more favorable attitudes towards learning. And in particular, because we're talking about the equity and the access agendas, that they find that it works for members of underrepresented groups even more, has more effect having a supportive learning group. And they've been studying this for years, as in 1989 data, and those effect sizes may not seem that large, but they are, probably 10, 15 points on a percentage scale of learning outcome increases in terms of not only the things that you would think about in achievement, but also self-esteem, how much time they spend on the task, all those sorts of things. So where's technology going with constructivist learning tools? Well, you've probably all been familiar with things like Google Docs, where we can create things online, we can manage, we can version, we get timelines, calendars, strong notifications so that you know when something's happening. You don't have to hang out at a website or go there. It'll ring a bell, an email, an RSS feed, or something to let you know that there's something you should attend to. There's lots of group tools that are very secure. They're hosted often behind institutional sites, learning management systems, Moodle and Blackboard and all those things. There's new decision-making and project management tools, and of course, synchronous and asynchronous tools, things like web conferencing that can be used to, multimedia and record, so it spans the synchronous, asynchronous dimensions. And we're starting to see user models of groups emerge so that the group can see how it's been functioning, how long they've been spending, what kind of decision-making skills they've been illustrating. And again, if those are open, people can start to learn about themselves as a group-based learner. And here's from their friends at the University of Wollongong, the SNAP Moodle analytics. And this is I'm sure some of you, maybe there's somebody here who even knows a lot more about this than I, but it's really neat to have a Moodle threaded discussion eaten up by the SNAP program. And it gives you who's talking, what's the role of the teacher or lead students, and are there students who are way out of bounds, not talking to anybody. And this is the same text displayed visually and displayed text-wise. And you can see that the top one, it shows some threads, and at least it's nicely threaded, but it doesn't really give you that sense of who's talking to whom like it does on the bottom ones. We're starting to get into, beyond audio conferencing, where this is Avatar Connect, where you can sit there, and have motions and smile, and it'll be reflected on your avatar for those people who don't want to engage in real life with the current body they were blessed with. They can get a new one, and it's a little, this is sort of like Second Life, only it's even more animated, because you're not, saying push the gesture button and the hand goes up, but you just put your hand up and your avatar's hand go up. I'm not sure what this will do, but one of our faculty thinks it's a real game changer, but I'm not sure. This is one of my favorites, is VoiceThread, and I only wish there was an open source knockoff of this, because it's a very powerful tool. The way it allows you to have an asynchronous conversation that can go on beyond one course. It could be open for a year or something. Students can add new voices. They can put text. They can put voice. They can put video. And the teacher can start it off, and you can export it, and it's a very powerful tool. But the problems with groups. Well, first of all, is the restrictions. If you're in a group, that means you have to start at the same time and march along together, and be there on it. If it's synchronous, be there on a Tuesday night at 7 o'clock or something like that. So it challenges people, especially busy people who are working full time. There's quite a bit of evidence that leadership is almost always asynchronous, is not symmetrical, that the teacher tends to lead and dominate, and the students tend to be passive and wait to be told what to do, sort of thing. It's often isolated from the world of practice, that what happens in the group is not what happens in the workplace, because they're different groups. And low tolerance of internal difference, sexist and ethnicized regulation, high demands for obedience to norms, all this sociological kind of evil things that happen when some people get together and put themselves in kind of an artificial situation. Groupthink, and then pathological politeness, which a friend of mine, Walter Archer, coined that term for, in the early days when we started using text conferencing, there was all this worry that there would be all this flaming and that people would be insulting to each other. It just didn't happen in my courses anyways, but this pathological politeness and failure to engage and really talk and argue with each other is a bigger problem, at least in my experience. And finally, it's not a great preparation for lifelong learning, because if you've only learned when you're in a group, then what happens when the group's over? You just haven't really got the kind of experience that's going to help you for life. So constructivist learning, again, it's probably necessary, but I think we need to grow beyond constructivist learning, and especially go beyond group learning. And that brings us to the third generation, connectivist pedagogy. I define it as learning that is defined as building networks of information, context, and resources that are applied to real problems. And this was, the term was coined by my friend George Siemens, who was actually invited here and sends his apology that he couldn't make it. But he's all over the net. If you're interested in following his blog, I'm sure you'd find it interesting. But he, in 2004, when he coined the term, he has his principles of connectivist learning. And I think there's 8 of them. I took the best 6. But the second one is maybe the most contentious, that learning may reside in non-human appliances. What he's saying, whether you're talking about learning or knowledge or which, it gets a little bit confusing. But it's sort of a net-centric. It assumes that all the students have access to the net all the time, and that they're offloading cognitive tasks and onloading. Sort of like we were used to use, all the controversy about calculators. Well, now we have, recorders and cognitive amplifiers and all sorts of other things. And you start building a pedagogy that assumes that all of that technology exists, and you come up with sorts of different skills. What's the use of memorizing timetables when everyone always has a calculator implanted in their head or something like that? Capacity to know is more critical than what is currently known. And always making connections to people, connection to knowledge sources, connection to data, and making sure that that's current. Connectivist knowledge is emergent, so it's very hard to define what the learning outcomes are, because they emerge in interaction with the learner. It's distributed and probably outside of even in a single institution. It's often chaotic, fragmented, non-sequential, and contextualized. Some of those things are very scary to some of our learners and some of our teachers as well. This is a great quote from Simon Burt, who writes, "People who live in the intersection of social worlds are at higher risk of having good ideas." And I think that's what connectivism does. It connects you to people, and you're bound to have some good ideas out of it. But it's also emergence. The very uncertainty and lack of predictability of learning outcomes will be the key factor that adds value to the learning community. We have huge debates at Athabasca about this, because our instructional designers are trying to get the unpredictability and the uncertainty out of the learning sequence so that people can, not get confused and not have to deal with different machines and different cowboy clarity is where they're at, whereas this is not that at all. Emergent learning will be one of the triggers to unleash individual creativity. So what's an instructional design for connectivism? There's wide open opportunity here because the Dick and Carey model really hasn't been invented yet. So anybody who's an emergent instructional designer and wants to write, how do you develop connectivist learning ideals? This is from an Italian woman in 2007. And she talks, you start with awareness and receptivity, so lots of exposure to all sorts of different things and different new connections, and then make those connections, but developing students' skills at filtering and winnowing down the fire hose so that they can actually make some sense of it. And then very important is that connectivists are always creating new artifacts. They're adding new things to the network of knowledge resources, and then thinking about them and reflection and metacognition. So there is a special issue of a Rodel on connectivism coming next month. Granier and George Siemens are the editors, and I hope that all those who are online are now getting their free subscription at a Rodel, so make sure you don't miss this. But there's some very interesting articles in that. One of the key things is transparency and persistence. And so, and you can see how much of a connectivist learner you are right now. Is just punch your own name into Google. What kind of a footprint have you left in the world for others to connect with you? And some of our students have very legitimate reasons for not wanting to have a footprint. They're being harassed or something like that. So this is a real challenge. It's just, is it good to be open, or what is privacy in a networked era? But shared awareness allows otherwise uncoordinated groups to begin to work together. And Stuart Kaufman, a biologist, always talks about the adjacent possibilities in evolution, that the more things you're exposed to and that you see, that gives you new ideas and allows you to make progress much faster than in a closed world. And so you expand the adjacent possibilities whenever you can. Connectivism is based on networks, not on groups. It's mostly self-organizing, contribute and people build social capital. And what I've been trying to do is to make, in my courses, is I used to run them straight through Moodle, and they would end at the end, and I would take away all the discussion groups, and we would start from scratch every year. But now I just keep adding and adding and adding, and adding the assignments that students are willing to share, so that your knowledge as a course or a program or a unit continues to grow and expand every year. It takes better filtering and better searching skills of students. But it allows them to build a net presence even within our semi-structured and semi-private world at Athabasca University. How do we build these networks of practice? Well, we need to give motivation to students. We need to use them. We need to model them ourselves. We need to give structural support, like good technology, wireless access. We need to give them new cognitive skills on how to search and how to disclose things that are at levels that they find appropriate. And we need to help them to get some benefits from having their net presence. Lots of challenges with connectivist learning. Privacy, as I just mentioned. Who's in control? Whose content is this? Does it belong to the teacher, the students, the institution? Very disruptive change issues. How can an institution support all of these different tools when they're just barely hanging on supporting Moodle? Then you say, well, I want this web tool, and I want this tool, and I want that tool. Most computer services people just roll their eyes. And how do you sustain motivation? Because it takes dynamic leaders at the current time, I'm afraid. But this is one way that the privacy issue is addressed. This is the tool that we're experimenting with at Athabasca called LGG. It's from Scotland, open source tool. It gives you blogs and wikis and bookmarks and profiles. It's sort of a Facebook-like equivalent, but we host it ourselves, and we do that so that students can feel like they don't have to contribute to Facebook in order to participate in our courses. But how do you set the privacy control issues, or who gets to read things? And there isn't any single setting that will meet all people, because for some people, restricting who can read it is really an affront to their civil rights and their capacity to build a net presence, whereas to others, it's a huge invasion of their privacy. So the way ELD works is that everything that you write there, you get to decide whether it's private, that means nobody gets to see it, or if it's people you are following, that's your friends sort of thing. People who are logged in to Athabasca, which is somebody with the password, the public, which is Google search engines and everybody, or any of these groups. And it can be, you can set up your own group, not just teachers set up groups, anybody can set up a group. And so you really get put in the driver's seat in terms of control of privacy. And so what connectivism tries to do is leverage this collective energy. John Drawn and I have written quite a bit about groups and networks and what the differences between them. And we used to call this the collective, but we realize now that really that was a mistake. The collective nature is just anything we do together, so it includes networks and groups. But the sets, where a set is people who are defined differently by their activity. And so that's where all this data mining comes in, is you might not know anybody who's in your set, just like I don't know people who Amazon books suggests books that I would like to read. I don't know the people who have recommended those books, but we belong to a set of people who have bought similar books before. And the more we leave net presence, the more it's harvested, the more these sets become useful for our decision making. So, just getting towards the end, how do you decide how to use each one of these three generations? And I'm sure that most of you have seen Bloom's old taxonomy, 1956. You probably didn't get through teacher school without bumping into it a few times anyways. Well, this is it on the left, and then Anderson and Crawwell updated it. They turned them into verbs, which was a nice start, and they sort of modernized some of the words, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, and then they switched the position of these two, and they put creating, which is sort of what the synthesis used to be, and evaluating, so it's a sort of an updated model. And if we try to map this onto those three generations, and I mean, this is quite arguable, and I haven't really defended this as well as I probably could and will, but I was thinking that understanding and remembering, and again, this is an important building block of all knowledge, is really the domain of cognitive behavioralist kind of technology. That's really what they're trying to get at, is a comprehension and understanding, a capacity to get this content and curriculum. Moving up to constructivist second generation, they're more interested in analyzing, especially in groups, and applying it, and partially in evaluating it for its relevance to their own context as they construct knowledge. And then connectivist comes in especially strong on the creating side. Connectivists are always creating, students are creating new content, modifying content, repurposing it, and putting it out again. And of course, when you're looking at the whole world of content on the web, you have to be good at evaluating and synthesizing and throwing away and filtering and all those sorts of things. So that's just my early thinking on how we can separate those three generations. So now a little bit of work from my friend John Drawn. He talks about which of these generations is best for an institution or is easiest or whatever. And the first generation, cognitive behaviorist, is more or less hard technology in that we have rigid structures, and we've always had to fight with the transactional distance, as Michael Moore would say, that's caused by the physical separation and often the temporal separation as well. But the real advantage is it's scalable. And when we're talking about millions of students, or as they are in many developing countries, this first generation is really good at scaling and making it so that we get a quality product that can be replicated across many thousands of students. But unfortunately, it comes often at the cost of reducing choice, but it also reduces insecurity, and insecurity for the tutors, for the teachers, as well as for the students. So it's relatively hard technology, like the picture of the assembly line producing knowledge and then distributing it. The second generation is much softer, less structure, more dialogue. Again, as Michael Moore predicted. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale. Most constructivist models, 30 students in a cohort, and that's it. Then you hire new teachers if you want to scale that way. And the third generation is like ponds forming. It's emergent and it's soft. And it's arguably scalable. George Siemens and Stephen Downes run these open courses where they have thousands of students. They don't charge money. They run for 8 weeks. It's a little unclear how much everyone is learning, but they certainly are very popular, and there's a whole flurry of activities. So it is definitely scalable, at least at that level, but it's very emergent, and I think different students get different things out of it. But it does force the learner into control. So if unfortunately, if all of our students were like that grade 7 that we talked about earlier, this would be a lot easier model to implement, but it isn't. So as John said, soft technology is hard to do, but soft is the real world, and that's the kind of world that where we should be training students to have at least some exposure at some time in their academic careers. It's not only in the formal world. This is a corporate trainer, a recent survey from the US, when they talked about using social networking for professional development, huge growths in the interest in using connectivist type tools to building networks, to sharing, to blogging, all these sorts of tools. So just to conclude, the recommendations for teachers like yourselves is to try to be just as fearless as that grade 7 student, to seek out and create opportunities to collaborate, and I'm sure that's why you are here, to develop your own personal learning system so that you're learning new tools as fast as your students are, and most importantly, to explore, experiment, and have fun. So, final slide, behavioral cognitive models are useful for memory and conceptual knowledge acquisition, also very scalable. Constructivist models develop group skills and trust, and connectivist models introduce network learning and are foundational for lifelong learning in complex contexts. And I hope that you'll agree that all three of these paradigms and all of those models are needed by our students today. And just giving some exposure some way, and maybe we need to partner with other institutions, and it will be a challenge to some of our learners, but I think they're not really educated unless they're competent in all three of those generations. And don't bother arguing about quality with different adherents to each one of those models, because their idea of what quality is quite different and divergent. So I posted these slides last night, and you're more than welcome to download them and add a comment to SlideShare. You got to add value, so don't just download, revise them and put it back up there. So thank you very much.